Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LEC Spring Playoffs Finals overview and analysis video. We are here, the final series, the final matchup between two teams here in the spring split for the LEC. We know the two teams that are going to be heading to MSI to represent the LEC, but what order will they be going in? Will we have our winter champions reigning once again here in spring, or will we see a bit of an upset and a dethroning of the old guard? It's going to be interesting either way. I'm excited for it. I hope you guys are as well. If you are excited, let me know down in the comments section below. What did you think was going to happen in this series? Did it go the way you anticipated? Were you surprised by the outcome? Would love to know your thoughts on everything. Did you enjoy the games? Did you think they were boring? Would love to know your thoughts on the meta and everything, especially as we head closer and closer to an international event. Of course, if you want to know my thoughts on everything that's happened up until this point, you can, of course, check out the semifinals video up in the iCard right now. I do preview this matchup a little bit at the end of that video. We'll talk about it more so before we talk in this series or before we get into game number one. But also, you can check out the playlist for the entirety of the LEC Spring Split up in the iCard as well. That's going to have every single weekly review as well as every single playoff game reviewed in that playlist. And so if you're interested in my thoughts on how we got here in the first place, that is definitely something worth checking out. But of course, today we are solely concerned with the final series of the split, the finals, the championship, the most important thing that you can play for in the spring split. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go game by game, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game. And at the end of the series, I will be giving a finals MVP to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Nothing else to preview at the end of this because MSI is around the corner and we're going to be doing our own set of analysis for that tournament. But by the end of this, we will know our number one team in the LEC, the team that's going to go straight in to the main stage of MSI, as well as the team that has to go through play-in. So let's get right into it. Of course, it is a finals matchup between probably the two most prestigious organizations in European League of Legends history. It's the number 3 seeded G2 Esports taking on the number 1 seeded Fnatic. And I say it in that order, of course, because G2 coming in through the winner's bracket, they have yet to drop a best of series all year long, whether that is best of 3 or best of 5. They are undefeated in those series, just the entirety of this year going back to winter, and they've looked dominant every single step of the way. There have been, I guess, some small speed bumps. They've lost games here or there, but it's never really felt like they were in all that much danger in any of these series, and right now, at least going into this series, I think the perception is that they are by far the best team in Europe, and it's not particularly close. And I've definitely propagated that ideology, that thought process across this year. I have definitely said that it feels like G2 and then everyone else kind of below them in terms of where the LEC is at right now. But, this team does have its own flaws. I think a couple of these players have stepped up from what they were in winter. You've got players like Broken Blade and Hansama that I think have been better than they were at the beginning of the year, but there are some concerns. Mickey X in particular has just not been very good across this year. He has had quite a few major issues in terms of his positioning and getting caught out in situations that he doesn't need to be getting caught out in. It feels like an even year kind of thing for Mickey X, where you look at 2021 and 2023 and you're like, oh my goodness, the odd years are so strong. He was the MVP of the entire league last year across all 3 splits. He just was the best player in Europe last year in terms of the performances he was putting out, and you expected him to be able to carry that through with a team that brought back all 5 members. But then you look at 2024 so far and you remember 2022 for Mickey X on Excel, and you're like, man, is there some curse where the even number years just don't go well for him because he really has not been all that good this year? I don't even know if he's been a top half support in terms of the individual, plays that he has been making. I think he's benefited a lot from having the rest of his team be some of the best players in the entire league. I think if he was on a worse team, it would be more noticeable just how poor he was playing, but hopefully he can figure things out. He was good in the finals last split, even though he wasn't great in the regular season. He's been worse in spring than he was in winter, in my opinion, but this is a player that has stepped it up when it's mattered the most in the past, and so you're hoping he can do that again. But all of that to say, they have the best players in the region, G2, and that's the reason that they've been able to get over some of these more minor transgressions across this year. Caps is just so far and away the best player in Europe right now, and it's not particularly close. He's actively winning every single series and every single game that this team is playing, whether or not he's on carry champions or or not. He is just so useful, either being able to set up everything for the rest of the roster, or alternatively being able to capitalize on mistakes that the enemy makes as a carry. It really doesn't matter what style you end up giving him. He has been proactive in that way, and Yike, I think, has also been incredible this year. I think that he's maybe been a little bit less of a carry in spring than he was in winter. I thought winter, it was very clear that he was the best jungler in the league. I think in spring, it's a little bit more up for debate because I think Caps has definitely taken more of the resource-heavy role. Broken Blade and Hansama, I think, have gotten more resources, and so Yike, I think, has faded into the background a bit more, but that's not necessarily a negative towards Yike. I think that's more of just a playstyle difference for G2, and so there's a lot of positives, but some negatives. This team isn't perfect, and Fnatic, I think, is the kind of team that could potentially take advantage of that. When you're talking about the weaknesses for G2, Mickey X has been a bit of a weakness, and who's been the strength for Fnatic in this playoff run? Noah and June, the bot lane, which you really would not have expected going into the playoffs. This has been a rather poor bot lane, I would say, throughout the entirety of the year. When you look at the winter regular season, when you look at the spring regular season, they weren't exactly lighting the world on fire. They were consistently losing the 2v2, but then you look at the playoffs for spring, and both of these players, Noah and June, have been exceptional. Two of the best players in the entire league in this playoff run. June, in particular, has maybe been the best player in the playoffs as a whole, maybe outside of Caps, who's also been excellent, but June has been the hard carry for Fnatic. He's played the best games of his entire career, and he's made his first ever finals at any level. Challengers League, LCK, it doesn't matter. He's never made the finals before. This is the first time. And Noah's also somebody that you can hope will be able to step up to the moment. It's really going to be about the rest of this team. Razork and Huma, you have to assume that they're going to be fine. They haven't exactly been the most consistent jungle mid duo across their time together, the last 3 or so years that they've been playing, but they were really good in winter, took a bit of a step back. It's been a lot more bot lane focused for Fnatic in the spring split. I think it should be fine. Oscar is a bit of a concern. This is somebody who, when he is not on some of the champions that he feels a lot more comfortable on, can sometimes run it down for Fnatic, and that's definitely more of an exploitable avenue for G2, especially with Broken Blade playing better in the recent weeks. But, it's really going to be about which team has the best players step up. If Noah and June are dominating the bot lane, I think that's going to be pretty in favor of Fnatic. If G2, has Caps and Yike and Broken Blade being the best players in the series, then they're going to run away with this. I think G2 are definitely going to be favorites heading into this series, but it's going to be interesting no matter what, hopefully, to see what ends up happening. So, without further ado, let's jump into the game-by-game analysis, and going game-by-game means we get to start with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was Fnatic. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and this is a phenomenal start for them. A pretty back and forth, all things considered game. I think Fnatic definitely had a lot of the priority, but it wasn't exactly a blowout in the same way that you would necessarily expect a blowout to be in the finals. It just was a game that was a little bit back and forth until it wasn't anymore, and then all of a sudden Fnatic pulls fully away, and we're really looking at the things we talked about in that preview at the beginning here, because it was the bot lane for Fnatic that continues to be the primary focal point for where they want to put a lot of their resources and for where they want to win the game through. We'll talk about it in a second, but for G2, their weaknesses kind of got exploited in this game. I've talked a lot this year about how, yes, G2 is significantly better than every other LEC team in terms of the grand scheme of things, but they are far from a team with no weaknesses. I've talked extensively about how I feel Mickey X and Hans have not had a very good 2v2, and how Mickey in general has just not been very good this year, and that was very exploited in this game, and so we'll talk about that when we get to them. But player of the game in game 1 simply has to go to June. 100% kill participation in a 29 kill game for Fnatic. That is ridiculously impressive. This team continues to run almost entirely through him in these signature moments, these really important moments in the playoffs, and that's huge. For June, a player that I've criticized a lot, pre-playoffs in the past. I thought he was really bad in winter. I didn't think he was very good in the spring regular season. Maybe he was a little bit better, I would say. They definitely felt more cohesive, but they weren't exactly a strong bot lane. You go into spring playoffs, and all of a sudden, the switch flips. The player that they brought in specifically to have synergy with Noah, all of a sudden has synergy with Noah, and the bot lane's winning 2v2, and they're able to play through them, and June has played by far the best League of Legends of his entire career. Again, as somebody who's watched him from his time on DRX Challengers, all the way through to the Kwangdong Freaks, now here to Fnatic. I've seen every step of the way for June, which is why I'm really excited to see him, play by far the best league he's ever played right now. And this Renata was a game breaker everywhere on the map, absolutely dominated the early 2v2, and then did a great job to transition that lead into the mid game, really being aggressive alongside the Xin Zhao and the Zac, trying to create more playmaking opportunities for those champions that want to be a bit more skirmish happy in the mid game. I think Renata is really important in that regard, and that ultimate really, really caused problems for for G2 whenever they wanted to try and contest any sort of major objective. Barons in the back half of the game, there's just no real easy way to deal with a super strong Renata that has not really made a lot of mistakes in the early game, and that's exactly what we saw. So credit to Fnatic, credit to June, he was really good here. And then Noah, you got to give a big shout out to Noah as well. You don't go 12, 3, and 12 on Varus by accident. Like, this was a very good game to capitalize on the things that June was setting up for. The bot lane is going to play like this if they continue where they left off against a team like BDS when they got that reverse sweep done. This could be a lot more of an interesting series than I think we ended up predicting it would be. So really excited to see that for them. Oscar was very good here on the Zac. Broken Blade going for the Sion, playing a little bit risky. You know, obviously on Sion, it's a little bit more acceptable to die solo in a side lane and just kind of, you know, take towers and ignore the game that way, but Broken Blade was not useful really in any way in this game, in my opinion. Oscar was definitely a lot more valuable to his team overall, and especially as we got later and later, he became harder and harder to deal with, to kill, and that passive is just really difficult to deal with in these major team fights when you also have to deal with, like, a Zir ultimate or Renata ultimate coming at you. Even Varus ult could be a bit of a problem, so Zac ended up being really, really difficult to take down. That's been a very successful pick at the LEC level. Razork, I thought, was really good in this game, certainly out-jungled Yike. You're looking at two relative early game junglers, both wanting to skirmish a bit more often than maybe like your Maokai or your Sejuani or your other junglers that have been very popular in the meta. Both of them want to try and keep their foot on the gas, and Razork just had more pressure, and Humanoid was good as well, even if Caps was by far the most relevant member of G2 on the other side. Overall, this is just a very good game from Fnatic, building off of what they did against BDS and keeping that momentum going. This is a huge win, number one. And for G2, as much as I'd like to sit here and say that, you know, this is a disaster and they should be worried about the rest of the series, this is exactly what happened last split as well. They lost game number one of the finals to Mad Lions because they just weren't as prepared. They went out and drafted something that was a little bit more risky. They didn't quite execute in the way they wanted, and so they just adapted. They went to something more meta, and they ended up winning the rest of the series. So as much as I'd like to say that losing game one puts them on the back foot and it puts them in a horrible position, they've been here before, and you still have to believe in the talent. However, there were real concerns in this game, and like I said, these are not new concerns for this team. Dud of the game is going to go to Mickey X. This Lulu was useless. If you're going to pick B5 Lulu, you have to be able to enable this Tristana like really, really heavily in the early game. You can't get outscaled, you can't get out-rotated, and you can't get out-fought. You have to be that big poke mage that Lulu was drafted for in the support position so you can translate into some mid-game skirmishes to help out the Rek'Sai, to start getting the Vigar online and scaling, and none of that happened. Mickey's positioning in particular in this game was super bad. Like, he was way too far forward, constantly being caught out by Renata, by Varus, by Xin Zhao, and it's just really disappointing to see. The Mickey X that we are getting this year is just kind of nowhere near what he was last year. I know that he's a little bit more proficient, I would say, on, like, I don't want to say tanks, but things like the Braum and things like the Nautilus. They're obviously a little bit more comfortable for Mickey, but if you're going to pick Lulu in the finals, you have to be able to execute on that champion, and he just didn't, in my opinion. He was far from the only player that wasn't relevant, but to me, he was the least relevant in the game. Broken Blade, I think you could definitely point to that, but again, dying on Sion isn't exactly the worst thing in the world. I just don't love Sion in the finals. I think this champion is just a little bit gimmicky right now, and I think Zac, he kind of showed the difference in terms of champion strength in this game. Zac is way more useful as a champion, way more relevant in a lot of these fights, and unfortunately, the Sion just never really had a chance to do anything. Rek'Sai was really out-jungled. We've basically exclusively seen Rek'Sai in the top lane ever since the rework. It's nice to see that she can still be played in the jungle. Yike has been one of the few players to actually continue to prioritize her, and I still think she can be strong there, but quite frankly, Razork was just better in game number one, and even if Caps was fine, even if Hansama, I don't think made any egregious errors, this team was not good enough to be able to take down a Fnatic team that clearly came to play in the finals. And so now you're down 0-1 after one game. You have to be able to bounce back here. You know, you're never really going to count G2 out because they can win 3 games in a row against anybody at any time. They've already shown that against a lot of teams, but you really don't want to lose all that momentum and go down 0-2. You need some of your players to step up. And for Fnatic, you need to keep your foot on the gas. If you can start this series 2-0, that's massive. Having to win only one of the final 3 games would be huge. But if G2 can tie it up, all of a sudden everything changes. So which one of those two things is going to happen? Well, the winner of game number 2 was G2 Esports. They are going to take game 2. They're going to tie up this series at 1 apiece, and we have ourselves a series, boys. We're moving into a best of 3 here as we head into game 3 tied, but game 2 definitely a little bit more of what you would expect from G2. Still some very questionable decisions. I still don't love their draft, and I think obviously there were some decisions in game that kind of reflected that draft a bit more. There are some conversations that are being had outside of the game about, you know, just a couple of the meta decisions and meta reads that people have right now, but Fnatic just making some crucial errors in the back half of this. They were in a relatively okay spot as we headed into the late game. However, they just couldn't hang on. You give over one Baron flip at a 50-50, and all of a sudden the game just starts spiraling out of control against you. So we'll talk about it. I want to quickly talk about the lane swaps, just because it's something that I really haven't touched on all that much on this channel. It's been relatively prevalent in the LCK as well, specifically. Like, Hanwha Life was doing it relatively frequently in their series against T1 in the semifinals. G2 obviously doing it here. I think it's more acceptable when you're doing it with something like Sion. That's kind of the point of the champion. We were seeing prototypical lane swaps last year with Sion, with teams like BDS really pulling out these weird movements across the map, allowing Adam to just kind of go around and help out the jungle, or move around and try to find matchups that are going to benefit his team the most. It's kind of the prototype of what we were seeing here, but generally I think lane swaps don't actually matter all that much. That's going to be kind of a disappointing thing, I think, to hear from me, because I think a lot of people make them out to be really big game-breaking decisions, but it's something that is different, but not in a way that I think actively changes the game in a huge and major way. I think in this game in particular, it hurt G2 way more than it helped. It put them pretty far behind, and it really forced them to play better in the later half of the game. Luckily for them, they were able to do that, but I don't really think there's a ton to talk about when it comes to the lane swaps. It's a meta read, it's a decision, especially when you're going to draft like Thresh and Sion, who I think both are what I would consider like setups for quote-unquote lane swaps. I just don't think I would personally do them a lot. I think it takes away a lot of the advantages that you get out of your bot lane. You're not going to be scaling nearly as easily in those circumstances, but it's just my opinion, and I think, over the course of this game we kind of saw that, but not a ton to talk about outside of that. Most of the action in this game happened in the late game, or at least most of the action happened with G2 being able to come back. Most of the interesting action, in my opinion. Player of the game is going to go to Caps in the mid lane on the Azir. I thought he was really good in this game. I think you could realistically give this to Yike for the Baron steal, and just generally for his gameplay as well. It really is up to your personal preference. I think Caps and Yike were the two that ended up winning this game for G2. Broken Blade Hans, Mickey still struggling a bit. Mickey actually had an okay game, I would say, all things considered, on the Thresh, but Hans, relatively irrelevant. Broken Blade not really doing all that much, especially after he got so far behind in the early game, but it's Sion. It's kind of what happens when you put him in that situation. But Caps and Yike were excellent in the back half of this game. Caps' team fighting is just simply better than everybody else that he is playing against. It is really fun to watch him play something like Azir. Nothing against the Veigar. I love Veigar. It's a champion that I've really been a proponent of on this channel over the course of the last few months. I think it's significantly better than things that are getting more play than it, things like Corki. Like, I don't understand why Corki's in the meta and Veigar's getting picked less. It just doesn't make a ton of sense to me. But Yike and Caps, I think, played off the Azir excellently. I think if you're going to scale into the late game, if you want to give Caps something he can just straight up win the game on, basically from any position, Azir is a very good shout for that. Now, Humanoid on the other side of this tried his best to keep things in check on the Aurelion Sol. That's another champion that theoretically should be good into Azir. I understand the R5 priority on it because it is going to theoretically outscale Azir. Azir is really meant to be this team fight carry, but nothing really beats Aurelion Sol in the back half of the game. The problem is that Aurelion doesn't really have any tools to create it on his own. Caps can be a lot more proactive in terms of the Shuriman Shuffle and just his positioning, whereas Asol, I think, does have to rely a bit more on Nico engages or Jax being able to peel off in a comp like this. And so, Caps had a little bit more agency, I would say, in this game, and that was very clear in the back half of fights, even if both of those players did play relatively well. And again, Yike stealing that Baron, that was a big game-breaking play. That was a backbreaker for Fnatic. It really did change the tide of the entire game, and you have to give him a lot of credit for that. Volibear has been something that we've seen prioritized a lot higher here at the LEC level than anywhere else. I'm sure LCS would play it if they were still in season, because, man, North America loves their Volibear, but EU also loves their Volibear. They want something that can compete with that Xin Zhao for early game pressure, but also doesn't just completely fade into the background in team fights in the back half of the game. I think Volley does accomplish that, even if his numbers are a tad bit worse, but really, this was kind of a 2v8. Mickey was fine. Like, it wasn't really a 2v8. I guess it was more of like a 3v7, but Hans and Broken Blade really didn't exist. I really don't think that the lane swap helped them at all, and it was really up to the rest of the team to bail them out. But for Fnatic, fine. Like, an okay game. You wish you got that Baron. If you get that Baron, you probably win this game. It really is that simple. I'm not going to try and sugarcoat it. I do think you're in a much better position if you can get Aurelion and Jax moving around the map and creating a lot of these chaos and these front-to-back fights. Now, there are still problems with this comp. I think Noah and June were very good in this game, but Kallista's just not going to be as relevant as something like an Azir in the back half of the game if you want a damage dealer in that regard. And generally, I think Razork actually played pretty poor in this game, which is why he's going to get my dud of the game. This is kind of a running trend. Razork has just not been all that great in the playoffs for this team. He has honestly lost them a lot of games, and I know a lot of people really like Razork, and I know I've gotten a bit of a reputation as a Razork hater on this channel over the past couple of years because I've just not really seen the top 2, top 3 jungle hype that everybody talks about. He'll have top 1, top 2 games, but I rarely see a top 1, top 2 series or top 1, top 2 like splits overall. And I think this is a good example of that, where he just simply needed to be better. I think if he would have been a bit more consistent in the back half of this game, they'd probably win it. I know that's hard to like put it on one player, but the Jax was irrelevant in some of these fights, and he is such an integral part of what they drafted that I think him underperforming really hurt them. Again, Humanoid played fine. I don't think Oscar was awful this game, and Noah and June were generally good, but Fnatic just didn't have the firepower, and once you lose over those objectives, when you don't have the best players in the series, when Yike and Caps are just out team fighting you in these circumstances, all of a sudden, the game does become a lot harder. So Fnatic now tied up at 1 apiece, and you've just got to be able to recoup from this. Really, I don't think draft was the problem at all. I think you put yourself in a pretty good position. I think you capitalized on G2 making some weird early game choices, and you really should have won this game. And the fact that you didn't, I think, means that you should just stick to what you're doing and hope that you can get some better performances out of your players. You need your important pieces to step up. Razork has to be better. And then for G2, this is a good win to keep yourself back on track, but this team is still far from perfect. They're making big early game errors, and they're able to come back from it because they're better at team fighting than everybody else, but this is not a clean team in its current state. I would love to see them come out in game number 3 and just be super clean, be super decisive, and, just win. Like, I would want both teams to be able to do that, but only one is going to be able to do that. So, who's it going to be? Is it going to be G2? Is it going to be Fnatic? Well, the winner of game number 3 was G2 Esports. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to take control of this series for the first time here, and they are 1 game away from becoming the 3-time back-to-back-to-back champions of the league here, going back, of course, to summer of last year. This was a pretty good game from them overall. Was a little bit testy, I would say, down the stretch of the game. It was relatively close. Fnatic tried to keep things interesting because of the Aurelion, because of the Zac, who are just generally going to be nuisances in the late game. June is very good at Renata, and so you get these situations where it is a little bit more difficult to end than maybe it would be in a traditional circumstance, but they have Caps. It doesn't really matter. Like, Caps is going to insta-win some of these fights. That one fight in the base definitely comes to mind, and then he's going to say, screw it, I don't want to play anymore, and he's going to backdoor and win the game. He's going to X-Peke, if you will, against Fnatic. I don't know if that's necessarily a fair way to put what happened at the end of this game, but still, very good stuff from G2. And piggybacking off of that, Caps is going to get player of the game here for game number 3. I really don't see any other reason to give it to anybody else. I mean, maybe you could give it to Mickey because the Blitzcrank was a bit annoying to play against in this one, but really this was Caps' game to win, and he did actively win it. He is the one who killed the Nexus by himself, and so he did win the game. Not only that, but his team fighting is just straight up better than everybody else in the entire region. It's honestly kind of ridiculous to watch him play against everybody else. Like, Humanoid is not a bad player. He is very good for this level, and he's having a relatively okay series on a champion that I think is pretty strong in the Aurelion Soul. However, it's just not even comparable. Like, Caps is so much better than everyone else that he is going up against. It is really not fair. And I don't expect that to change. Like, this has been how he has been all year long. Like, I know I've said this a lot over the course of this year, and so if you watch a lot of the videos, you're probably tired of hearing it, but this is prime Caps. Like, this is 2019, 2018, 2020 Caps. This is the best version of Caps, just kind of bringing himself back here, and it's even more important now than it was back then, in my opinion. Yes, back then he had better teammates, and they were able to get to World Finals, and they were able to win MSI and all of that, but this G2 team would not be the guaranteed #1 best team in the region if it weren't for Caps being as good as he is. He is so clearly the #1 player in Europe. It's not even remotely debatable at this point. The only other player in the world right now who has the same kind of dominance over his own individual region is probably Chovy over in the LCK, and that's pretty elite company to be involved in. Like, there is a conversation to be had where he could potentially be a top 5 to top 10 player in the league, or in the world, not in the league, in the world right now, and that's crazy for Caps to be able to get back to that level. But again, great game from him on the Azir. I think at some point you just have to get him off of this champion because he clearly feels too comfortable. The rest of the team was generally fine. Like, Broken Blade was pretty good this game on the Twisted Fate. All things considered, Oscar had a couple of problems in the later half of this game actually being able to team fight. I know Zac is pretty consistent, and I don't necessarily blame the player entirely for this because it's hard to stay relevant when you're just getting beaten down from long range over and over again by the Azir, and, Blitzcrank Hook is always going to be a bit of a problem for the Zac, and so there are some concerns, I would say, overall for Zac in this matchup, but Oscar just wasn't as relevant in this game, and Broken Blade was, and so you do have to give him the edge on that. Hans and Mickey didn't really make any any sort of egregious errors. Mickey had a couple of really good hooks. I thought his roams in the mid game were actually really solid and really beneficial to the team as a whole. And again, Hans didn't make any mistakes. All he had to do was pressure Noah in the early game, which is exactly what he did. And Yike was fine. I don't think he really did anything all that special. It certainly wasn't game 2 from Yike, but it wasn't game 1 either. So that's all you can really ask for. But it's Caps versus the world. Truly, it is, Caps being the best player in Europe that is dragging G2 across the finish line so easily. And for Fnatic, they put up a fight. Like, they tried in this game. I don't even think they necessarily played all that bad. They just weren't good enough to be able to win fights. Down the stretch, you lost the Baron. Oops. You lose that fight in your base where Caps just outplays everybody. Oops. And then all of a sudden, he's in your base and he's taking your Nexus. Oops. Like, it just ends up happening. I don't think anybody was particularly horrible. I think Humanoid was a little bit too far forward in some of these fights, and I think that's definitely something you can nitpick, but dead of the game for me is going to go to Oscar Rinnan. Like I said earlier, the Zac just wasn't relevant really in any way, shape, or form. He didn't really get to do any of those big engages. He didn't really get to keep a lot of the pressure on the enemy team. He was just kind of there. He was just kind of along for the ride. And I think you would have expected more from a champion that, quite frankly, has performed very well at this level. You B1'd it. Like, clearly you know that it's strong. Clearly you feel comfortable playing it here, especially because you have very good support for it. I think Poppy is very good support for it. Varus is typically very good support for the Zac. I think it's just unfortunate that Oscar wasn't all that relevant, but it's hard to pinpoint one player who played bad in this game. It really wasn't, oh, Fnatic was horrible and they just had no chance to be able to win. It's more so G2 at Caps. Like, I really hate to simplify it down. I'm like usually the guy that is anti-black and white narrative. I'm anti this player better than this player. That means game over. Typically, I want to talk about the nuance. That's why I started this channel. That's why I do these breakdowns. But sometimes there is no nuance to talk about, in my opinion. Sometimes Caps really is just that good, and sometimes the games end that fast. There really isn't a lot else for me to say in terms of this section, in terms of the analysis here, and so I guess we're now moving on to game number 4. It's do or die for Fnatic. If they end up losing this, obviously the finals are over. They're still going to MSI, but they'd love to push this to a game 5, and honestly, they've been masters at that over the course of this playoff run. In both of their best of 5 so far, they've gone to 5 games, and they've been able to make it work in the final game. Can they do it again here against G2? Can they keep that streak going, or is G2 going to be able to close this out in 4 games, very reminiscent of what happened in the previous split against Mad Lions? Well, the winner of game number 4 was G2 Esports. They are going to take game number 4. They are going to take the series, and your 2024 LEC Spring Split champions are going to be G2 once again. Their 3rd title in a row, their 4th title in the last 5 finals. This is the most dominant organization in Europe, and it's not particularly close at the current moment. This group of 5 players is just outplaying and outlasting everyone else in the region, everyone that they are going up against, and it is crazy to see. For Fnatic, they at least put up a fight. This was a pretty fun series. They definitely tried a couple of things, and they took advantage of some of the weird mistakes that G2 made across the series, but unfortunately, they just didn't have the same kind of mechanical skill to go toe-to-toe with them, and that's just been the case for everyone going up against G2. You can talk about the things that they do right. You can talk about some of the plays that they do wrong, G2 in particular, but there just isn't enough firepower on these teams to be able to compete in 5v5s at the end of the game, and that's again what we saw here. We'll talk about it as we continue to go along, but Fnatic got to regroup and got to get ready for MSI because it's right around the corner for them. But for G2, player of the game in game 4 for me is going to go to Hansama. I understand that holding your flash in a lot of these fights is really horrible, and him not necessarily playing well at the beginning isn't ideal, but he held them so that he could get pentakills in the back half of these fights, and you know what? It's the finals. Go ahead, my guy. If you're going to go 17-2-5 on Jinx, getting a couple of pentakills along the way to match Caps, that's pretty darn good. He's going to get player of the game. I get that maybe he could have played some of these fights a little bit more clinically, perhaps going for less of the hero ball plays and perhaps a little bit more oriented around the rest of the team. However, it ended up working out in his favor in the long run, and he was by far the better bot laner in this final game of the series, and so I do want to give him credit for that. Not quite player of the series as a whole, but very good in game number 4 in particular, and he is going to get player of the game, player of the series. Come on, man, it's Caps. How this isn't a conversation. I saw some people complaining that Caps got finals MVP on Twitter, and I don't really understand why. It feels pretty obvious to me that Caps was the best player in this series. He was amazing in game 2. He single-handedly won game number 3 by himself. Not that he also didn't do that in game 2. Him and Yike were definitely the focal points, but just because he had this game on the Taliyah where he was a little bit too far forward in a couple occasions, they very much focused him in a lot of these fights. That doesn't mean that he played horrible. Taliyah is just one of those champions that's going to attract a lot of attention because of how strong she inherently is and how strong her kit is, and so Caps being focused down, being targeted, just opened up more space for Yike and for Hansama and for Broken Blade to be able to do a lot more in this game. And so Caps is going to get my finals MVP. He is the best player in Europe. It's not up for debate. It's not even a close argument, in my opinion. You know, I've seen some people throw a couple of names out there. Humanoid and Razork have been two of the names that have been thrown out as potential players that could be on Caps' level. I'm sorry, the series just proved that they're not. Humanoid wasn't even all that bad in this series. He played relatively fine, but Caps is just that much better than everybody else that he's going up against, and this was just another great example of that. A truly phenomenal series and a truly phenomenal year so far from Europe's best player of all time. Broken Blade and Yike, like I said, were also very good. Mickey played the R5 Thresh relatively well. As much as I hate R5 Thresh, as much as I don't think it actually does all that much in this particular comp, and as much as I don't think I would really recommend doing this in a lot of circumstances, I thought Mickey was fine. He played some of his better games here in the finals, if only because he wasn't really all that noticeable, and that's generally more of a positive than the negatives that he has been giving for a lot of this year, but he was relatively okay in the finals. Broken Blade and Yike were good in this game. Yike was everywhere on the map, and sometimes that was a negative, but for the most part, that was a positive. But Hansama was definitely the one that you're going to look at, taking away a lot of those kills in Game 4, getting the pentakill, etc., etc. So really good stuff from G2, and they are champions once again. This group of 5 players has now won 4 titles together, and really, it doesn't seem like it's going to be slowing down anytime soon. If there was ever a split that they were going to take off and take a little bit later, it was probably going to be spring here, because they had already qualified for MSI, they had already qualified for, you know, the season finale. There really wasn't a ton of reason for them to win spring, but they did it anyways, just because they can, and that's incredibly impressive. And then for Fnatic, you tried your absolute best. You were able to take a game here, and you at least made it relatively interesting. The series wasn't as much of a blowout as perhaps it could have been predicted to be, but again, they just don't have the firepower to be able to keep up. Credit to Humanoid and Oscar Rinin, who I thought were relatively okay here in Game 4, but again, the rest of the team just wasn't good enough. Noah was targeted over and over and over again in this final game. He is going to get dead of the game. It's hard to really criticize Noah and June because they had been kind of the reason that this team was in the finals in the first place, in my opinion. They were the ones carrying this team in a lot of games leading up to this in the playoffs, and, you know, it's really hard to sit here and be like, oh, Noah and June were so bad, because they were fine throughout a lot of this series, but Noah definitely got taken advantage of in this final game. G2 had a very clear game plan, which is make sure the Varus does not get out of control, and it was just, he was dove over and over and over again, and he was focused in team fights over and over and over again. You gotta feel bad for him, but when it rains, it pours, unfortunately, on a low mobility AD carry like Varus, and he just really wasn't ever allowed to play the game. Razork in the jungle, I think, also had a really rough series, all things considered. I think a lot of people really want to be higher on Razork than what I am. I think I've gotten a lot of criticism in the past for not being as high on Razork. He was excellent in the winter split, arguably one of the best players in the entire league. He was pretty good at the start of spring, but then you look at the final week of the regular season, and he had a couple of problems. He wasn't all that great in the playoffs. It's just the inconsistency that Razork has always been known for, at least in my opinion, going back to the Misfits days. This has always been who he has been as a player, is somebody who on his best day is going to be the best jungler in Europe, and on his worst day is going to actively lose you games. I'm not saying it was individually him that made all of the mistakes, but I don't think he played a particularly good series here in the finals. I think you can make an argument he was the worst player for Fnatic across all 4 games. Like I said, Oscar and Humanoid were fine. Huma was maybe a little bit too far forward, but man, was he going out there trying to make plays, and I think that's all you really needed to do in this game. He insta-won one team fight that actually put Fnatic in a relatively okay position. Around 20-ish minutes into the game, unfortunately, they just couldn't hold on to that pressure, and June, I think, was also relatively fine in this game. He has shown a lot of improvement, and he was pretty good in the finals overall, but again, really the takeaway is that Fnatic just don't have the firepower. They don't have the juice to be able to keep up with a team like G2, and it's not anything against Fnatic. Nobody in Europe has that right now. Nobody has the ability to keep up with G2 in these major series, because Caps and Yike and Hans to an extent, and Broken Blade and even Mickey in this series, they're just too good. They're just too much for a lot of the rest of this region to keep up. It's going to be interesting to see what happens to a team like Fnatic at an international tournament. They're going to have the opportunity to prove that it's not that Europe's, middle tier is not very good. It's rather that G2 is actually very good. That's what Fnatic is going to get a chance to prove in the play-in stage, but they're going to have to go through some tough competition. Remember, every single region is in the play-in stage represented by at least one team, and so it's not going to be easy to get out of it, at least as the first seed, but Fnatic is going to have an opportunity, and I think these players could do something intriguing because they have gotten better throughout the year. But for G2, they are going to enter the main stage of MSI. They are going to be your champions once again, and there's just nothing else to say. They are the dominating force in Europe right now. It feels like a Man City situation in terms of what what G2 is offering. They are just so consistently the best team in their league, in their region, and hopefully they get a chance to prove it at MSI. I'm not entirely sure that this team's weaknesses aren't going to be exploited a bit more when they play against teams that are a bit more clinical or a bit more mechanically talented, teams that actually can go toe-to-toe with their best players, but hopefully the dominating force that they have shown domestically can translate to something international, maybe a bit more than I'm expecting. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LEC 2024 Spring Split Finals overview and analysis video, and of course that means we are done with the 2024 LEC Spring Split in general. That is it. It's wrapped, it's done, it's dusted, it's time for the mid-season invitational for these European teams. 2 teams will be representing, of course, G2 and Fnatic from today's series, but that means 8 other teams have a lot to get ready for as they get ready for the Summer Split. I'm really excited to see what ends up happening. There are already some rumblings about movement and changes in terms of some teams and the players that are going to be on them. I'm excited to see where things go, but if you guys enjoyed not only the finals coverage, but the coverage of the entirety of the LEC Spring Split, I'd love to know down in the comment section below. Of course, it would mean a lot to me if you left a like on this video, if you hit that like button. It really, really does show me that you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit subscribe. Now that the LEC is done, we've still got other things to cover, of course. The LPL, the last region to continue to go along. The finals are next weekend. We'll be covering the semifinals on this channel in the upcoming days. And of course, MSI just around the corner. The biggest international tournament outside of Worlds that we are going to get for most of this year. I'm excited to cover that in detail as well. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all